It's nice to see folks outside of the Astra group braving it, coming up to the villa. So my talk today, let me see here. Okay, so I'll begin today with these two pages, these two folios from the Egerton manuscript. What you see on the left is this Melothesia, and this comes from the Guild Book of the Barber Surgeons. And the Melothesia, as Luigi said, is the arrangement of the 12 zodiac signs on the human form. And so that is on the left. And what you see on the right is a volvel. So a volvel is essentially an early calculator. So you have this paper, or in this case, a parchment wheel, which is marked and has a pointer, and it's pinned with a little thread, and it allows you to spin the needle to line it up with a specific date. And in this case, because this is for the Guild Book of the Barber Surgeons, who would have done bloodletting in at this time period, instead of the 15th century, instead of doctors who would have been doing therapeutics, what this volvel allows you to do is line up a date, and it tells you, let's see if the pointer, there we go. If you line up this arrow here, this is when the new moon is, and it tells you when to actually do the bloodletting. So if a particular sign is active, or the moon is in a particular sign, or the sun is in a particular sign, the astrologer, the astrological doctor in this case, the surgeon, could figure out whether to or not to do the bloodletting. So my question was, the Zodiac Man image, which is quite ubiquitous, shows up in not only European sources, but Indic sources, Middle Eastern and Iranian and Pahlavi sources. And so my question was, where does it come from? And so here in this engraving, you can see the various stages of bloodletting. So here's our zodiac man in the middle. Is Pisces governing his feet, Aries at his head, each of the zodiac signs. And here's your doctor doing the bloodletting to this Renaissance woman, an ailing patient in bed, right? So you see it becomes a really important practice, and then it continues to be in use through the Victorian age. So George Washington, for instance, dies from this procedure. He loses 4 pints of blood, and he dies of a sore throat, but really from all the blood loss. So I'll have 3 parts in this talk. I'll open with this Melothesia, and I want to focus on this idea of time as an embodied substance, and how it can be manipulated through the use of gems, which are used as healing amulets. The second part, I'm going to use that Melothesia discussion, where I examine a text called the Yavana Jātaka, to then inquire the category of the Yavana itself, right? So what do we actually, what should we be thinking about? Who should we be thinking about when we say Yavana, beyond just the idea of the Indo-Greek? And here I'll go back over this, but Ionia to Yona, so Greek is the Ionians, right, on this western coast of Turkey, to the Achaemenid Yona, and then eventually in Sanskrit to Yavana. And I'll argue that I think in terms of conceptualizing what the Yavana is and who they are, that the Kushan Empire, which is an empire that flourishes between the late 1st century BC up until the 4th century CE, is critical for understanding not only how astral sciences develop, but the Indic sciences more broadly develop in conversation with Hellenistic sciences. And to do that, I relocate our focus from Alexandria, which is often and pretty much always the center of scientific inquiry when historians go back to the ancient world, to Takshashila, or Taxila, as the Greeks would call it. And finally, I'll end with some thoughts on what and how I think we should rethink Hellenistic science and identity alongside these categories of Shastra, Ars, and Techne. So if you are not a classicist, if you don't do the ancient studies, this is our timetable right here. So the 1st through the 4th century CE. I go a little bit past that, but generally this is the chunk of time. Our 2 primary authors are Manilius and Spudjitvaja, who you'll hear more about. and the primary texts are the Astronomica and the Yavana Jātaka. But what I will do is branch off from these texts to do intertextual analysis. So there will be other treatises that show up. So to begin with, the Astronomica is a Latin poem that even classicists loathe. I don't know, Paul, you might feel differently given our mutual interest in the astral sciences, but Manilius is a Roman poet. He's writing between the 20 and 40 CE, we think. We don't really have any biographical data, but his manuscript of the Astronomica was discovered at the same time as the manuscript of De Rerum Natura, which is Lucretius's famous poem on atomism, by Poggio Bracciolini, when he was basically kind of stealing manuscripts on his humanist hunt for ancient texts at the Library of St. Gallen. So this is an illegal photograph that I took when I was there, but it is totally worth a visit. It's not too far from here if you haven't been. But the key thing for us to keep in mind is that one, he's the first source that I can find that discusses Melothesia, this theory. And then two, he is our earliest Mediterranean comprehensive treatise on the astral sciences. Okay. The second sort of focus text here will be the Yavana Jātaka of Spujitvaja. Sanskritists will all be familiar, especially in the Astra group, but it was a treatise that probably dates somewhere between the 1st and 7th century CE. So Bill Mack, who's another excellent scholar of the Sanskrit astral sciences, one of the leading scholars, suggests that it could be a much later date. For the purposes of my work, I think it is somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE. What we're told in the text is that it's composed by this individual named Spujitvaja. We, once again, don't know really anything about him. He calls himself a Yavana Raja, so a king of the Yavanas. Once again, does this mean that he was a king? Probably not, but once again, it's what the text tells us. There are few manuscripts of this particular text, but the most important one, or the critical edition, was put forth by David Pingree, who translated it in 1978 in a 2-volume, very comprehensive commentary. But now this has begun to be revised. So the very last chapter of the text has been revised by Bill Mack, and there's a lot more work to do on this treatise. So this first part, I kind of want to figure out where this idea of the zodiac man, the Melothesia, originated. So here you have more diagrams of the vain man, and this appears throughout Europe. So Italian, German, French sources. Usually the text is in Latin, but keep in mind, this was also when like Bologna had its anatomical school sort of flourishing. And so this type of understanding what the vessels are in the body, where they go, what they do, was also in vogue generally. So here's our chart of what the Melothesia essentially is, right? Quite a simple theory. But the question is, where does it come from? So one question is why I'm even interested in this. So aside from its ubiquity, aside from its use in this like bloodletting practice, I'm interested in it because it's one of the few medical theories that we have that remains in use from basically the 2nd century or the 1st century CE all the way up through the early 20th century, late 19th century, and in what we would traditionally consider post-Enlightenment, European Enlightenment cultures, right? So in Europe and in the UK and in France and Germany. So if we're thinking about science as this thing that is a European sort of creation that catapulted us into modernity, or the rest of the world into modernity, we really need to think critically about that. And I think we all can agree on that since we're here at Max Planck. So here I'm going to take a look at a few passages from the Astronomica and the Yavana Jātaka to kind of give us a starting point for this. So in the Astronomica, it appears twice. And here's one of the examples. So I'll read just the beginning part here. And just as the human form is apportioned to the signs, and although their guardianship universally goes over the entire body, it also goes forth individually over the divided limbs. For Aries clings to the head, Taurus to the neck, and so on down to Aquarius defending the shins and Pisces the feet. And then it ends in the same way, different signs claim different lands for themselves. Okay, so the idea is that you have not just an anthropomorphizing of the zodiac signs, but of the entire cosmos itself. So all different parts within the cosmos have to be in balance and healthy for this cosmic body, this corpus, to function properly. And then the next couple lines here. For this reason, because of this zodiacal control, the human race is distributed with differing laws and different body types. So here, the idea is that different races of people, meaning different tribes of people. So how do you translate this term here, gentes? Highly contested in classics, but for this purpose, I'll use race, are formed with their particular skin color, and throughout the bodily frame, the artus, the associated laws, mark, signant, so literally stamp these body parts with a suitable substance, or a substance that is suitable with their own contract, so with their own bond, foidus. So we have here this idea of how the cosmos is interconnected, but then how every single geographical location and every single human body and individual body parts within that human body for every single person, right, is governed by these different cosmic laws for Manilius through the zodiac. Now, there isn't just one type of Melothesia. So Ptolemy, who is probably the more famous and the one that you've all heard of, in the 2nd century, he puts forth different types of Melothesia, and he uses the planets. And Manilius curiously says that he will do that, but he does not actually do that in the text, which is why some scholars think that the text is not complete, and maybe there's a manuscript out there in another library that needs to be stolen. But for now, he doesn't give us that. But you can see how the idea of where and how these planets govern different regions of the body is quite scattered compared to something that we find in Manilius' simple Melothesia, which can easily kind of be memorized and mapped. Now, the Yavana Jātaka, and this is why I thought this was an important project to embark upon, opens with this same Melothesia arrangement, but then maps it onto the body of Kala Purusha, or the cosmological time man, who is part demiurge, but then also embodies the cosmos itself. Okay, so here we don't have the first 13 verses, but in what remains, so what would have been like these introductory kind of praise verses, but what we do have is this. So the first sign is recalled, so smrito, so recalled or said to be the form identical to the ram, Aries, and it was called the head of Kala, and I put in Purusha, so the head of the time man, by the previous ones, so either texts or the astrologers. Now, we don't have a precursor to this, right? So we don't know if he's actually reading something, drawing from a particular text, or if this is a nod, sort of a formulaic nod to a tradition that is much older. And Aries represents, as one might expect, goats, sheep, the unfrequented path, so little billy goat trails, valley, cliff, mountains, stone as like a physical object or a natural formation, robbers, fire, mineral mines, and the earth with precious stones. And he goes on to give the rest of the zodiac signs. So what you see here is kind of this combination of what Manilius has, right? So not just a biological thing, but a mineralogical, a geographical, but it's not geographically specific as it is in the Roman context. It's more landscapes. And this matches with the way that geographies are broken up in the legal text, the Dharmashastras that we have from the Sanskritic context. So here's our chart of these different geographical locations and regions, but then also activities, various types of things. So the Melothesia is not just a simple bodily thing, but then you can begin to see how you can use it to then begin mapping all these different parts of the world, or how he suggests we do it. So that would be a very clear and simple sort of narrative. But John Wee, who is a student of Mark Geller, who first wrote a book on Melothesia in the Babylonian context, he took a tablet that I think Mark Geller had originally translated. I don't know. Do you know, Paul? Yeah. Okay. And so he had originally translated this, and then he retranslated it. He was like, okay, we're going to fix some things. And what he found is the same Melothesia that exists in Manilius's work. So the problem is cuneiform, depending on who you believe in terms of the Syriologists, was maybe used until the 3rd century CE, definitely up until the 1st century or through the 1st century. And then as a writing system, if it ends, what about the people who can still read it? One presumes that there are still people literate in it. So this kind of throws a wrench in our very clean linear narrative because John Wee says this could be after Manilius, it could be before him, it could be drawing from Manilius. We just cannot prove it. There's nothing in this tablet to tell us that. So if you haven't seen this paper, if you're interested in Melothesia, his paper does an excellent job of kind of extending what Pingree did and giving us a very comprehensive table. So I've borrowed this from him for showing you here, but it's a great paper. Now, the question is, how is it used for healing? And if you're a classicist, you know this idea of environmental determinism, but it's something that the Brahmins are also very familiar with, though in different terms. So the idea is that a geographical location affects the biological psychophysiology of an individual. So if we're thinking of nature versus nurture, here it's kind of mostly nature. So you'll see things, so the airs, waters, places, the Hippocratic text is one of our first places where we see this theory. And he says there in Europe, tribes that differ from each other in stature, physique, and courage. The differences, as he talked about earlier. So he says, so here's an example of this. If you live in a mountainous region and a place that is damp and the season changes are dramatic, those people are going to be bigger and they will be acclimatized to having greater endurance and greater courage because they have been nourished by this environment, right? So obviously this is not correct according to modern science or modern notions of how geography affects people's health, because geography does affect people's health. But this idea of environmental determinism kind of continues and is shared by ancient Greek, Roman doctors, and Indic doctors. So we'll see kind of how this functions. Now here, I've given you a map of Manilius's zodiacal Melothesia, but on the globe. And so the key thing to keep in mind here is the only sign that governs it, or the only place that is governed by a single sign is Italy, which is governed by Libra. And he makes a lot of this because he says Libra are the scales of justice, the scales of Zeus, et cetera, et cetera. And so only Rome, which at this point is an empire, has the ability to raise and lower the pans and destroy a people or to raise them up into prosperity. And so this, I think, forces us to think about these theories together and say, okay, how are the astrologers then drawing on pre-existing medical theories to make sense of geography, which is part of the astral sciences and vice versa. So here are more geographical locations. So Italy, as I said. The other place is Ethiopia. So Cancer, in the Tropic of Cancer, produces the hottest part of the season, or part of the hottest season of the year. And so the Ethiopians, since they are darker skinned, according to Greek and Roman medicine and historiography, they are eith-ops, right? So burnt faced. This is what that translates to. And so he assigns Cancer to this. And this is something that gets continued even in later astrological Greco-Roman texts. Now, the Hippocratic works talk about astral medicine. So they tell us or in Airs, Waters, Places, once again, the author, we don't know if it is Hippocrates or one of many Hippocratic writers, says that knowing the changes of the season, the rising and the settings of the stars, and how each of them occurs, the doctor, he will be able to know beforehand what sort of year is going to follow. And then, knowing the sort of history of how the science of how the seasons operate and knowing the seasons in the past, he can kind of figure out what's going to happen, right? So it will be admitted on second thought that astronomy contributes not a little bit, but a very great deal indeed to medicine. For with the season, digestion changes. So if you're familiar with Ayurveda, this should sound kind of familiar, but we'll take a look at a couple passages. So Manilius picks up on this. And so in astrological chart writing, you have the 12 lots, and the 11th lot is the one of vitality. So Manilius says, this is the one that governs us overall in our vitality. And there is no other station, this is the part I want to focus on, there is no other station or lot which demands for itself either the time or the type of healing or the time for administering it, right? So when drugs are given, when drugs are mixed up, and which hour is best for therapy and the mixing of life and health-giving medicine. So this is as close, I think, as Manilius gets to the idea of a muhurta that we have in the Indic astral sciences. So astral medicine, I think, is an important sort of way to understand not only the psychophysiology or the way that they are understanding psychophysiology, but then to really question the work that medicine and astrology are doing. So prognostics and diagnostics, right? Both of them are very caught up in trying to do both of these practices. And we have to remember that, at least in the Roman context, there is a bit of competition in the Mediterranean context between medical practitioners and astrologers. And it's not until Galen in the 2nd century CE that we have a direct acknowledgement of this. And Galen says, okay, if a patient wants to go to the astrologer and get treatment, that's fine, as long as they also do all the stuff that I tell them to do, right? So we have this kind of duality of two different pathways to heal, but their methods, probably because their methods are somewhat similar to each other. Now, the difference, though, is in the scope, right? So while a doctor can tell you, okay, based on your current climate, where you are, your health so far, here's how your illness will progress. The astrologer can, of course, tell you, okay, you were born at this time, and therefore, for the past 20 years, you were meant to get sick on this day, and then this illness will last for this many days, and it might recur 20 years from now, right? So the scope of treatment is quite different. The other thing that astrology does is it allows astrologers and astrological medical practitioners to think about time as a physical substance in the body and something that can be manipulated. Okay, so one example of this is Sirius the dog star. So if you went to the catastrophe talk yesterday, all I could do is think about this image of Sirius the dog star, which Sirius rises in the dog days of the summer, the hottest part of the year. And the end of Manilius's work talks about the end of the universe, or the end of the world as we know it, with Sirius, as he flies over the Earth, beaming out fire and heat at the Earth and scorching it as he goes across, and then that will then regenerate, or from that will be reborn a new world. Now, when the sun, when Sirius comes, it's particularly dangerous for men, according to the Roman and the Greek medical system, because men have drier bodies compared to women. And so the purging effects of this constellation dry out the male body. And so men have to take extra care during this time. And funnily enough, Laurence Totelin is one scholar who's also written on this. And she talks about how it's one medical author says, well, if you're a woman, it's actually good for you because now your body is becoming more male because it has some of the excess moisture in your body has been drawn out, right? So the male body for Greek medicine is the ideal. And so how do men protect themselves? One way, which I argue for in one of my articles, is through the use of these amuletic gems. So what you have here are images of a dog's face, which is Sirius, the dog star. And a few of these are particularly interesting compared to others. So I'm going to focus on this one here. This is, oops, made of garnet. This gem here is made of garnet. And if you notice, there's a cut across. And the reason the cut exists, and we have to put this together from other medical and mineralogical treatises, is that when you were under the effect of the star or you were being afflicted by it, you would take the gem, the medical practitioner would cut it, and then the powder from that would be put into your potion, and that's the medicine that you would drink. And then the gem could be put back together and worn again, kind of waiting for you to use it again. So here we have an example of that. This is another gem, and if you look here, it's kind of hard to tell. Let's see if I can zoom in. Ha. So here's our dog's face. He's kind of turned to the side, and there's a chip in his face right here. And we don't know if this was something that someone bumped into, or if it was intentionally chipped, which we hear about in other types of medical practices, when a chipped piece is then used as a part of a medical or a pharmacological treatment. So chip it and then grind it into your medicine and then take that. So not only are you being protected on the outside through this act of cosmic sympathy, showing the dog star, oh, I know that you're ailing right now, and I'm wearing this ring with your face on it, so please don't hurt me. But then you're consuming the red quality or the purple quality of this same constellation through the gem, and that is protecting you from the inside. Now in Ayurveda, we have something similar. So here I'm going to jump back in time to take a look at some of the Ayurvedic treatises. But in the Yavana Jātaka, we are told that the zodiac also divides up all these different categories. So divisions of caste, so jati, jana, your tribe, your nationality, place or location, are declared in regular order, along with the zodiac signs themselves, which are fixed by innate dispositions. So niyatai swabhavai, so their innate quality to these different locations and places with reference to the different limbs and the geographical location. So this should sound very similar to what we saw in Manilius. Now, in Ayurveda, we have just a lot of discussion of Kala. So I'm sure Anthony will have perhaps way more knowledge of this than I will, but a few passages stuck out to me. And so one is kind of in the very, in this discussion-based passage in the Charaka Samhita, where a monk, Atreya, who is said to be the founder of a school of medicine itself, there are multiple schools of Ayurveda, and who was working in Takshashila, he talks about how time, there are all these different causes. There's a debate going on. What is the cause of illness? And Atreya says, since Prajapati, who is the patron of his creations, would not constantly inflict sorrowful conditions upon them like a cruel man, a person, a Purusha, is born from Kala, time, along with his diseases. The whole universe is governed by Kala, and Kala is the universal cause. Now, they go on, and in the debate, it's concluded that it's not just time, but time remains an important medical factor or a cause of illness. So we have more passages here. So Kala is time, or Samvatsara, the year. And here I want to draw our attention to this last line here. So Kala here is called parinama, so either a transformation or a change. And this idea is that the change that we see occurring, right, is not only caused by time, but exists in the body, I'm arguing, as a physical entity that is making this change happen. Okay. And the reason I think they think about it is because of this type of logic that's in the second passage. So the misuse, the non-use, and the overuse of time, intellect, and sense objects is the triple cause of all mental and physical illnesses, right? So time. So if you spend way too much time drinking, or you spend way too much time, I don't know, at the baths, going through sweat therapy, or whatever it might be, at the sauna or the steam room, right? All of these things, time is a fundamental aspect of how healing works and how disease can occur. And so we find a similar logic here from the Mediterranean context, but from an earlier treatise with Charaka. So kala is a dravya, essentially. So it's a medical substance. And we're told that disease, according to Ayurvedic theory, at least in Charaka, comes from three different factors. So one is asatmya samyoga. So unwholesome, I guess, joinings of your different sense faculties and then the sense objects. So things that don't agree with you. So if you have an allergy to something, right? This is a thing. I just had an allergy reaction last week, so which is why I've been thinking about this. If you have an allergy to something, your body does not agree with that object, that can cause illness. An intellectual error. So perhaps you are not correctly within your senses and you take a particular action, that can hurt your body as well. And then finally, transformation, right? Parinama as kala. So time, I hope I've sort of laid out the case here, is not just this thing that is happening in the background, but it is an active sort of thing, a dravya, an element, an elemental substance in the body, a physical substance in the body. And we see this kind of play out in the Yavana Jātaka. So the Yavana Jātaka fundamentally is caught up in Samkhya metaphysics, Ayurveda, and the Dharma Shastras. And so here we have different elements, the five Mahabhutas, the Pancha Mahabhutas. You have the different bodily fluids, so the three doshas, the three humors. You have different types of medical material, so similar to Aristotle here, kind of plants, minerals, and finally, you have these isras, which is a set of categories that actually come from Samkhya philosophy. But I just wanted to show you here that we see it's not just two different ideas that I'm bringing together. We see how they are actually interwoven in the text itself. So the very last thing is, what do we do with gems, or how are gems used in healing? So for this, the idea of prabhava, which is the specific action or the inherent capability of something, is critical. So drugs are efficacious, not only due to their properties, but also due to the specific action, the prabhava, of their substance, dravya, one, their inherent qualities, guna, and then three, the combined effect of substance and inherent quality, each at its particular moment, kale, right? So in that particular time. So here, the idea is that you need, once again, the good practitioner in medicine has to be a master of timekeeping, right, as well as all the actual drugs that they're using. And this is where the use of money or gems comes into play. So religious therapy, there are three types of healing. So religious, daiva, yukti, which is logical healing, or psychological. The religious therapy, we're told, consists of mantra recitation, but then wearing roots, aushadhi, sort of maybe as like a pouch or something like this, or tied to a part of your body, and then the use of money. Now, we're not told how they're exactly worn, but the fact that they're being used here, I'm interested in this idea of the prabhava. So they're using it, and they say it's because of the particular quality of this substance. But they also kind of make the caveat, because they want their cake, they want to have their cake and eat it too, that the different effects of wearable gems is because of prabhava, and the special action of their special power is said to be achintya. So beyond comprehension, unthinkable. You can translate this in a few different ways. So how exactly does this work? So that's something I'm trying to piece together. But we see much, 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 much later. So 14th century now. Um, in a text called the Jātaka Parijata, the use of or the connection between 9 different gemstones and then the 9 different grahas, or the celestial bodies. Now, how this comes about is something that a lot of scholars have like written about, and we don't have the textual evidence to like really help us nail this down. But it's a practice that develops early on, is my point, and continues to be used even actually in modern astrology and medicine in India. So from there, I want to jump to our second part here, contextualizing who the Yavana is and what the Yavana means, or what I'm going to argue it means. So Ionia is sort of this western part of the Persian Empire, kind of its boundary zone with the rest of the Mediterranean, with the Greeks. Here's where most of the battles that classicists have to learn about happen for a good part of 3 centuries almost. But this zone here, I want to recenter our map, not just to think of this as like the Persian Empire, but to then think about the idea of Ionia, Yona, or Yavana as expanding from here, right? This traditionally what is considered Ionia, all the way to Gandhara, to help us re-envision what a text like the Yavana Jātaka, who it might be referring to, where this knowledge is coming from as a broader geographical expanse. So Ionia essentially can be defined in a few different ways, but the easiest way, I think, is through the question of Greek dialect. So there are different Greek dialects, but the Ionic dialect is the one that kind of defines them to this zone. So Ephesus and Miletus are 2 kind of main cities here. But we also should remember, okay, this is way smaller than I thought it would be, that the Greeks were colonizing southern Italy. So here we've got Ionic dialect being spoken in mostly northern Sicily, a little bit here. But anyway, just keep this in mind. But my point is, as we think about what this category of the Yavana is, we have to include the region that some of this type of exchange of astral knowledge between the Mediterranean and South Asia might have been happening. Now, before I go to that, Ionia is famous in Greek philosophical context and scientific context because of the pre-Socratic, that's not what they called themselves, but this is what later philosophers who fetishized Socrates called these guys, who were brilliant, but this group of thinkers who were natural philosophers. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but the key thing to keep in mind here is that they are most likely part of a broader intellectual sort of exchange going on between, I would argue, South Asia and what's going on in the western part of the Mediterranean. One, there's enough linguistic similarity. 2, the geographical connectivities that are brought about through the Persian Empire facilitate this. And 3, some of their theories to early Indic philosophical ideas are so similar that it's almost impossible that there was no conversation going on. Now, if you ask me for where's the proof, can you give it to me? I cannot give you this proof, right? So this is something that will eventually, I think, as people excavate more texts and archaeological evidence as well, sort of come to light a bit more. But given the wars that we're in right now, who knows if that will actually ever happen. One thing I'm interested in, this is a different side project though, is sort of tracking where tyrannies exist in antiquity, where democracies exist in antiquity, where monarchies exist, and where scientists come from. And quite interestingly, in all of Ionia, we have tyrants in power who are not hereditary rulers, but people who are put in power by seizing power. So they're good demagogues. Well, not good demagogues, sorry. They are demagogues who take power and they say, I'm going to, defend you, et cetera, et cetera. What seems to happen is they have the financial and the political sort of singularity in a way to put resources into scientific investigation. And they're on this part of the Mediterranean world, which is connected with the rest of Asia. So I think what we have here is this kind of an interesting question, or a lot of interesting questions I think can be asked about the relationship between politics and the development of science early on, especially natural philosophy. But to return to the Yavana Jātaka here, I want to explain myself a little bit and tell you why I'm interested in the Kushanas, and why I think that they are a critical component to the story. So this is the very last chapter of the Yavana Jātaka. This is something that this is primarily the thing that has been written about the most. This one chapter, because it contains Greek technical terms that are translated from Greek into Sanskrit or transliterated. And here is sort of the one of the points where I got started thinking about what the Kushanas have to do with this. So the epoch, or the calculation of the Yuga cycle, according to the Shaka calendar and the Kushana. So the Shakas are the Scythians or the Indo-Scythians, and the Kushans. And what we're told is by adding 150 to the number of years elapsed of the Kushana calendar and subtracting that time from the Shaka calendar, the remainder is the number of Yuga years that have elapsed. So for me, the use of Kushana here is marked because it's kind of rare. We don't really see the term Kushana appear in Sanskrit literature. Usually it is Tushara. We see various other terms, some of which I'll refer to. But to me, that's like, okay, it's clear that by this point, probably the 3rd century, when the Kushans have their own, they've come to their conclusion that they're going to call themselves Kushans, that we have a text like this emerging. And geographically, I think it works. Now, who are the Kushans? If you are familiar at all with any of the Tarim Basin caves, where we're finding, or where there were found a lot of Sanskrit manuscripts, Koroshi manuscripts, etc., and Mogao. The Yuezhi people are part of this broader Xiongnu Confederacy. And sometime between like the 3rd century BC, there are all these sort of tribal wars going on here in this early Mongolian period, or region. And one group, the Yuezhi, makes their way down into Tibet, and another group makes its way down into central India. So this Yuezhi also goes by the name Guishang, and that essentially, scholars say, becomes Hoshana. So this group that migrates down doesn't behave in the way that you would expect the Mongols to behave, or an early steppe nomadic group to behave. So they don't come down, do a bunch of raids, and then go back into the heartlands. They come down, fight a bunch of wars, and then stay, and then create this very syncretic empire that lasts the better part of 4 centuries. And I think that that's a particularly interesting sort of oddity in this time period, if we're thinking about sort of migration down from the steppe and how those peoples usually behave. So I want to focus on this city here, Taxila or Takshashila, because it comes sort of right in the middle of the Kushan heartland. Now, Takshashila existed since at least the 6th century BC. It was the easternmost capital of the Persian Empire. It was later the northwestern capital of the Mauryan Empire, and it changed hands so many times because of its location along the Khyber Pass, right? So into Gandhara, this opens up the passage into China. It opens up the passage into the Mediterranean, overland, of course, but and Takshashila is also written about in Sanskrit sources, Pali sources, so in the Buddhist canon, and in Mediterranean sources, as being the home to some sort of a center of learning. A residential center of learning is what we can surmise from the data that exists. So an early type of university center, not as well sort of organized based on the archaeological evidence that we have as Nalanda, which is a second university center that develops in the 5th century CE. But nevertheless, a really important critical point for scholars to meet and empires to converge. And so that's why I think a place like Taxila or Takshashila merits at least some consideration as a parallel point with what's going on in Alexandria. So working in Takshashila are a few different people, one of whom is Parnini, who composes the earliest grammar that we have of Sanskrit language, sometime around the 6th century. Once again, Sanskrit dates always on a range. But he talks about the Yavana or the Yavana Lipi, so the writing system of the Greeks, right? Which totally makes sense given that if we're in this region, we know that the Achaemenids are in contact with Greeks. Now, the fact that this is a Yavana script, we don't know if he's actually referring to Greek script. It could be Western peoples, but the category of the Yavana, as it appears in a text like the Yavana Jātaka, has a very long, sort of capacious temporal and sociocultural significance, say, or range, a semantic range. Now, Takshashila is also a really important center because one, we know the Buddha visited there. Mahavira, the founder of, or one of the Tirthankars, one of the bridge makers, the teachers of Jainism, was said to be born not too far from Takshashila. So it's a place that's constantly on the map. But during this time, the broader region of Gandhara is a place that is famous for all of its Greco-Buddhist art, syncretism, et cetera, et cetera. But it's during the Kushan period that we get a very important transition. So Buddhism, Brahmanism, Jainism, various other ascetic sects are active during the Kushan period. But before the Kushans, we have only aniconic depictions of the Buddha. So you have his Vajrasana, his throne. You have the tree that he sat under to gain enlightenment, or when he attained enlightenment. But you don't actually see the Buddha himself. So sometimes it'll be footprints. Those will be the marks of him. But it's during the Kushan Empire that you actually see anthropomorphic depictions of the Buddha appearing, right? And so I think this is kind of a critical moment in rethinking how religion is also evolving under the Kushans. So in this coin of Kanishka, you have him here on the left. On the reverse of the coin, here's a standing Buddha. There's Bodo, written in Greek script. And there's the Buddha, the more popular sculptural sort of type that we see, right? So you can track it, which kind of makes this a very interesting period. Now, Ashoka also talks about the Yavanas in his rock inscriptions. Here he's talking about Antiochus, the Seleucid ruler. So my point is that the term Yavana has been used over a long period of time. Manu, in his Dharmashastra, which develops from probably the 3rd century up until the 1st century, 3rd century BC to 1st century CE, he refers to a bunch of these barbarian groups, and among them are the Yavanas and the Shakas, so the Scythians and the Yavanas. The Mahabharata, the Sanskrit epic, also refers to them. And here I want to highlight that in this collective of peoples, right, these are all barbarians. You have the Yavanas, you have the Gandharas, so the people in that northwestern region, you have the Shakas, the Scythians, and then the word that's more often used for the Kushans in proper Sanskrit literature, or in classical Sanskrit literature, one might say, is Tushara. So, which might be semantically related to Tocharian. So you have these different references to the Yavana, but when it comes to timekeeping and calendrics, this inscription, I think, is really kind of fascinating. It was first translated, I think, in 2015 by Richard Solomon. And it's a reliquary that has an inscription written in a circular form or in a spiral form, and it includes 3 different calendrical systems. So in the 27th year of the Lord Vijayamitra, so it's being dedicated by this queen, Rukuna, and her husband is Lord Vijayamitra. So in this 27th year of his calendar, his regnal calendar, the king of Apracha, in the rule, which is called that of Aziz, in the 201st year of the Greeks, of the Yona calendar, in the month of Shravana, right? So now we've got this mixture of the Greek calendar, we have these regnal calendars, and we have the Indic calendar using the nakshatra system with Shravana, right? All being brought together in this one inscription. So this is buried at a stupa in Badar. So once again, in that same Northwestern region. And it points to the sort of coexistence and the comfort that people had with all these different calendrical systems in this region. So here are our Kushana rulers, but I put this up here mainly to give you a sense of the time period. So this is from the newest editions that were published, which are open source, of the Kushan coins. And the British Museum and the American Numismatic Society put them out. But here, Kujula Kadphises is our first sort of Kushan ruler, and I want to focus on him, Kanishka I, and then Huvishka. So from 50 CE to around 200. Okay. And I put this up here just to give you a sense of how their names change. So from the earliest period on inscriptions, you have Korsanu, Horsanu, all these different sort of spellings. And by Kanishka the first, it standardizes to Koshana. So whatever their ethnic sort of cultural imperial ideology is going through, these shifts and these changes, it consolidates by the time Kanishka comes into power. Okay. So there's a lot of discussion, and I'm not really going to focus on this, of how the Greek coins and Roman coins inspire Kushan coinage. But I'm more interested in the divinities that appear on these coins. Okay, so there are many, many gods that appear, but they are given Iranian names and have equivalences to Hindu gods. Okay, so one of the most famous is the Owisho coin, which all the iconography of the god points to the Hindu god Shiva. And we also have these beautiful fresco panels from the Met. And here we see essentially the same form, right? So there's this the similarity in form that's maintained, kind of how we see in the Mediterranean world as well. So here's Shiva once again, or Owisho. More frescoes of these gods. Pharaoh is a Near Eastern god who is a god of divine light, often associated with kingship. And then we've got Serapis, Zeus, Ahura Mazda, sort of all in one sort of a divinity, one that the Greeks were familiar with as well as being this Eastern deity. So Kanishka produces many, many coins, all these different gods on them. Now, how do we put that together with religious spaces? So one inscription that helps us do this, which is now theoretically in the Kabul Museum, unclear what's happening under Taliban, but the Rabatak inscription, which is written in Greek script or Bactrian script, is important for two reasons for me for now. One is the king, Kanishka says, I'm inaugurating this temple, and he issued a Greek edict and then put it into the Aryan. So it was a text that was translated or transformed into Aryan. Now, what does Aryan mean? Does it mean Sanskrit? Does it mean Indo-Iranian as opposed to Greek script? Kind of unclear. But if we match it with what's going on the coinage, we have early coins having Greek and Gandhari engravings or inscriptions, and you have Greek and Bactrian script. But over time, right? So from Kanishka's reign down to sort of the end of the Kushan period, you have an entire shift away from Greek writing to Brahmi, which then matches with the use of Sanskrit language as well. So this transition from Greco, sort of Iranian, this Bactrian language and script system is occurring also under the Kushan dynasty. And that, I think, is very important for understanding how the literature is developing during that period. Now, the second reason this is important is because you have the first explicit indications of divine equivalences between different gods. So Uma becomes Nana, you have Mahasena. But for me, what's interesting is this the presence of this god Vishaka and Mihir or Mira. Okay. And how are these gods arranged in this one temple site? That particular temple site at Rabatak has not been excavated, but Sirk Kotal is a site that has confounded Greek archaeologists because it doesn't match what they would expect at a Hellenistic Greek temple site. So what you have here is not just a sanctuary to a single god who would have been kept here, but a sanctuary to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different gods, right? All arranged around. So what probably is happening is this type of a temple structure is something that the Kushans are invested in establishing throughout their empire. And this is what we see at Surk Kotal. Now, going back to the Vishaka question, I'm interested in what Vishaka is up to on the coinage, along with all these other celestial deities. So here we have Mao and Miro. Mao is the moon god, which you can see with the half crescent. Miro is a divine sun god or a god of light, so Mithras in the Mediterranean, Greco-Roman context. Here they are talking to each other. Here we have three gods. Skanda Kumaro, or Skanda Kumara, the prince Skanda, who is in Indic tradition the son of the god Shiva, who is a god of war, equivalent to the god Mars or Ares in the Mediterranean, and Bizago, who is the Bactrian for Vishaka. So Vishaka is not only present as a divinity, but is once again brought up as a divine god of warfare or in a military context, because he's alongside Skanda Kumara, who is essentially a god of war. And finally, here you have Skanda Kumara and Bizago talking to each other, just like Mao and Miro are there. So what do we do with something like this? And so I look back to the Yavana Jātaka, and the Yavana Jātaka tells us in a chapter on military campaigns that a king desiring to accumulate the territory of two kingdoms and having the power consisting of armies and treasure should march in the afternoon when the moon is in Vishaka, the nakshatra. So this is a lunar mansion. And so what I think is happening here is we have something that's not at all foreign to the Indic world or to the Mediterranean world, the anthropomorphizing of celestial deities and entities into gods for them to be able to give them attributes and see them when they're in action. Okay. Now, the Kanishka is also very sort of interested in using the sun and the moon imagery all over his stuff. And this is the Kanishka casket reliquary, which is one of the most famous artifacts that we have. This is the electrotype copy that's in the British Museum. But here we have Kanishka in the middle, and here is the moon god, Mao, and here is Miro, once again, both garlanding him, right? So anointing him as the king. Now, the Buddhists, of course, critique astrology, but it's not something that sticks. So the Buddhist critique of astrology, the Buddha apparently says, do not engage in these soothsaying or these predictive practices because that goes against the Buddhist ideology of how fate operates. The Buddhists, as we know, and those of you who work on the Turfan sites or the Turfan manuscripts, Buddhists love astrology, and they're quite good at it too. Now, what we find in the Yavana Jātaka is a reference to the Buddhists, but here it gets aligned with different planets. So Mars, right, this god of war, fiery, red, is associated with the Buddhists, probably because of their ochre robes. Venus, which is one of the more beneficent planets, governs the Brahmins, as does Jupiter, which is the best of the planets. And then finally, Saturn, which in the Indic tradition is the worst of the planets, governs these other Shramanas, or these naked ascetics who are who have taken themselves essentially out of the Brahmanical system, societal system. Okay, so what I think we're seeing here is this period in Kushan scientific and cultural history when we see these different groups kind of competing for power, but then also figuring out how astrology functions within the system where it's accepted by some groups and rejected by others, right? So it works for the Brahmins always, but not so much for the rest of them. Now, Takshashila, I'm sort of focusing on that because of a few other reasons, right? So I talked about this already. It's a center for learning. It's a convergence point. But it's also where, as I said at the very beginning, where Charaka is said to have worked, and his teacher, Athreya, is also said to have lived and have worked. And Buddhist tradition gives Takshashila a really important role in medical teaching. So early Buddhists and the history of Ayurveda, we don't really know how much of Ayurveda is from the Brahmanical tradition and how much the Brahmins are borrowing from and exchanging with the Buddhists. But the Buddhists are said to have trained in medicine there. Um, and the fact that the Chinese tradition picks up on this, or the fact that they pick up on when they're talking about Takshashila, is that they talk about Charaka being the personal physician to the king Kanishka, right? So now this poses a problem because the timetable extends, right? So if Charaka is supposed to be this sort of very, very ancient medical writer according to the Sanskrit tradition, maybe he aligns more closely with the first and second centuries CE, or I guess second through the third century CE. But once again, we have to keep in mind Sanskrit treatises are accumulative, so they keep growing. And when we have something that is a consolidated text, it's usually something that has been in development for a longer period of time. But I also go to the Kushans here, because I think they not only give us a transition point from Greco-Bactrian and Bactrian language to Sanskrit, but then they also are right before this transition period to the Gupta Empire, or the rise of the Gupta Empire, which is so often called the Golden Age, or said to hearken this Golden Age of Indian literature and like a sort of a Renaissance period. But as with all Renaissance periods, there's always a lot of stuff that's happening before then that motivates that period. And so I think the Kushans are the people to look at, or at least one of the groups to look at, when we're trying to figure out what's happening then. So in the 5th century, all these texts, these Ayurvedic treatises, the Mahabharata, the epics, the Puranas begin to be written. All of them talk about how scholars say that they are compiled and sort of finalized in that 4th and 5th century, but they must have been under development, right, for at least a couple centuries. And the evidence within the texts seems to suggest that they were. Now, the very, very final thing I'll say here is that the shift then, right, so once Takshashila kind of falls from prominence, the shift goes to Nalanda as the medical center, or as the center for university type of training and education, and that is said to be a very big residential university. So Buddhist sources talk about this a lot. So here we've got, so mostly 7th century Buddhist sources. Fa Shan, when he goes through India looking for these different Buddhist sites, mentions Takshashila, but really does not give us a lot of details about it. So perhaps by the 3rd century or 4th century CE, it had kind of fallen from its prominence, right? So that's how these dates are kind of being assigned by scholars. So here, the other thing is that as a classicist, one sort of field that has been burgeoning, and as it has been here too, from what I can understand, is how do the Chinese and the Romans and the Greeks all interact with each other? What does that exchange look like? And given the evidence, I think we have to look to the Kushan heartland as being the passage for this exchange to happen, right? And so this is another reason why I think the Kushans are worth considering here, not only for connecting, the Mediterranean and this northwestern region of India with the broader Mediterranean, but then also thinking about how Mediterranean ideas are coming into South Asia, being reformulated and making their way back out into China. So this very last part here, I want to talk about what Hellenistic science is, now that I've sort of given you a sense of how I'm using this material, and some of the historical context. So Hellenistic science begins, or the study of it kind of begins with Geoffrey Lloyd, who is, the greatest of the sort of founding figures of the history of science and classics. And he defines it sort of in these ways, using Alexandria as a model. So the interweaving of Greek and non-Greek ideas, mostly with Egyptian, Mesopotamian ideas there in Alexandria, more specialization of scientific disciplines. So you have like a discipline of geography or of medicine, et cetera, et cetera. Research centers being established, and the royal patronage being required for the funding for these types of spaces to exist. And I think what we find is that this has a lot in common with what is going on in the Kushan Empire. Um, in a place like Takshashila, and later on in places like Nalanda, Vallabhi, there are numerous university sites. There's a really great book by Lowe and Yasuhara called Ancient Centers of Higher Learning. And they do this great job of bringing together a global history of the university before the university, right? How this idea emerges. Um, then you have Lucio Russo, who originally wrote in Italian. It's been translated into English, and he wrote a book called The Forgotten Scientific Revolution. And here, he says that Alexandria is the starting point for thinking about what science is. And he connects it directly to the modern notion of European post-Enlightenment science. And he does something quite controversial. He says, classical Greece did not have science. Science only existed during the Hellenistic age in Alexandria. And then the Romans are a pre-scientific society. So they too, even though they inherit all this knowledge, do not actually have science. And he's really focused on axiomatic thought, right? So that is his foundation. And then finally, we have Reviel Netz, who wrote another really compelling narrative, right? Who talks about defining Hellenistic science through deductive logic, something that we know that the Buddhists, the Brahmins, the Jainas are all obsessed with doing. Technical terminologies, which if you've studied Sanskrit philosophy, you know has no shortage of. And then written transmission over oral tradition, right? And this is, once again, one of these clinching points for a lot of historians of science. And this is something that the history of philology also has cultivated, is that if it's not written, if it's just a conversation or a debate, it doesn't really qualify as science. And that is, I think, a fundamental flaw in how we think about what science is during this period. Reviel Netz is also a mathematician and historian of math. So his focus is on mathematical training and geometry. So what it kind of comes back to is Hellenistic science is considered true with a capital T, or is said to discover a sort of capital T truth because it uses geometric proof, visual written proof, as its method of debate and argumentation, as opposed to traditions in South Asia, which were mostly oral tradition, or texts don't have the good fortune of having survived because of climatic conditions. Now, David Pingree wrote a kind of what I find is a very funny title, Hellenophilia versus the History of Science. But in this article, he redefines how I think we should begin to think about science during this period. Science, he says, is a systematic explanation of perceived or imaginary phenomena, which is like the broadest definition that one could possibly come up with. But he points out that mathematics or numbers are just one symbolic language for understanding science or explaining scientific findings. And I think if you're interested in sort of figuring out how to go about understanding Hellenistic sciences, you have to start with this, because this question of what is capital T true is something that I think the modern academy is also questioning. And it's interesting to see how this same problem is being debated in the ancient sciences. So since he says that numbers are just one symbolic method of explaining something, he puts into question the very notion of geometry as the foundation of scientific proof. And if you study the Indic sciences, what you find is that the proof is not in geometry or in numbers. Even if you're a mathematician, the proof is in the grammar of the language itself. So in the early curricula that we have from Nalanda, from Takshashila, Buddhist, Brahmin, Jain students would all train in the same curriculum of 6 years of grammatical training, followed by another 3 years of specialized grammatical philosophical training in their own school, right? So we have this shift, not away from numbers being able to tell you something that is a fact, but rather shifting back from the numbers to the language itself, right? So one might argue it's an even more foundational notion of what proof is, since you need language to communicate it. And Pingree also emphasizes the incompleteness of explanations. And he's like, we should be okay with that because modern science also does not give you complete explanations of phenomena. It gives you its best explanation at a certain point. So now to shift to a very, very modern notion of what science is, I was taking a look at this National Academy of Sciences page, and I was like, how does the American Academy define what science is? And they say that there are four scientific goals, which I find quite similar to or quite applicable to how we think about what Hellenistic science is up to, or Indian science during the Hellenistic period is up to. So it describes the world through taxonomies and classification. It explains the world. It predicts what will happen, and then it intervenes in some way, right? So I think we saw that with the astral sciences or astral medicine, that all of these things are happening, right, to a certain extent. And then you've got five core principles that science must rely on, they say. So nature is not capricious. Good. Ancient people also did not think that was the case. Knowledge grows through exploration of the limits of existing rules and mutually reinforcing evidence, right? So the convergence of astral science and medical science, we see them being brought together to strengthen their practice. Science is a communal enterprise, science aiming for refined degrees of confidence rather than complete certainty. And scientific knowledge as durable and mutable, right? So not only is it something that can be fixed for a period of time, but new findings can change what you believe. Now, what I think we have to add to this, right, and what I think is important here is that they don't say anything about God. They don't reject religion, right? They don't reject a notion of belief. And I think that astrology and astral medicine and these ancient sciences really force us to interrogate this boundary between the religious and the scientific. So medical science and navigation, all these sciences that are geography, all these sciences that are brought together are taught and transform over multiple generations. And if we are questioning whether they're doing science, right, they aren't doing experimental science, which is always kind of the clutch point, I would say, for how modern historians of science critique ancient science. But they are interested in tracking patterns, right? And experimentation is not the only way that modern science comes about its conclusions. So what we saw in the evidence that I presented is that you've got a diagnosis, you have an etiology that can be sort of drawn from the evidence that's presented. You have a diagnosis made that fits in a certain category. And then there's a prognosis that's given, right? So how long will your fever last or whatever that might be the case. But this type of predictive science, this type of systematic analysis of the cosmos can also be applied to everyday things. So whether that's going to war, as we saw with the example with the coin, or Vishaka on the coin, or it's any other sort of when your child is born. So the Ayurvedic treatises really focus on this. So if your child is born at a certain time and date, it should be positioned in a certain way on a piece of cloth. There's another section about how to change the sex of the fetus based on the nakshatra. So I sort of conclude here, right, by thinking about how we should re-envision what the Hellenistic sciences are. So I talked about some of these things, but here, right, thinking about Sino-Greek or Sino-Mediterranean exchange must pass through this Kushan territory. And so I think it's worth interrogating what this idea of the Yavana is, even if it is this very broad term, at least within the framing of this one text that we've got, this Yavana Jātaka, and then its associated sort of expanded text, the Vriddha Yavana Jātaka. I think we have a compelling sort of moment of scientific exchange, but then also development, right? So it's not this Greco-Arabic model of which now is also being critiqued, right? Of translating an entire treatise, but it's the movement of a single idea and then its cultural sort of contextual development within each of these places. And then make it even more complicated, a polyphony of those types of syncretic developments that are occurring, right, in a place together. Hellenistic science, I argue, doesn't really, we can't label it this thing, right? This idea of Hellenistic science, because if we look at what's happening with the movement of astral science knowledge into around the Tarim Basin into China, that is a form of Hellenistic science too, but it's now been reformed into Indo-Hellenistic science, into Indo-Kushan, Iranian Hellenistic science, right? So this category, I think, in a way, is kind of moot. We can't really work with that anymore. Do I have a better category? No. So I can't answer that question yet. But it's something I'm sort of grappling with. And finally, I hope that, with some of this evidence, that I've successfully helped us think about how we shouldn't think of Alexandria as a single hub for this type of development, but a hub in this sort of network of intellectual centers that are very active and perhaps just as proliferative in their developments and their contributions. So, okay, that's all. Thank you so much.